What if everything you believed about death was wrong? Not medically, not scientifically, but culturally, emotionally, spiritually. Right now, somewhere in the world, a community is celebrating the death of one of their own. Not mourning, not weeping into dark clothing at a silent graveside. Celebrating. With music. With dance. With laughter so loud it echoes through the hills. With food prepared for the deceased as though they're still seated at the table. With the body of the dead kept in the family home, not for hours, but for weeks. And here's what will genuinely unsettle you. They might be handling grief better than we are. The Western world built an entire architecture around death designed to make it disappear as quickly and as quietly as possible. Sterile hospital rooms. Closed caskets. Condolence cards with pre-written sentences. Grief counselors who give you a timeline for when you should be over it. A funeral industry worth over $20 billion, built almost entirely on the premise that death should be processed and removed from daily life as efficiently as possible. But across history, and still today in communities the modern world calls primitive, death was never something to be removed. It was something to be completed. The Torajan people of Sulawesi, Indonesia, keep their deceased relatives in the family home, sometimes for years, feeding them, speaking to them, including them in daily life as though the body is simply resting. The Famadihana ritual of Madagascar involves digging up the bones of ancestors, wrapping them in fresh silk, and dancing with them through the village to music. The jazz funeral traditions rooted in West African death ceremonies turn grief into a procession that celebrates everything a life was rather than mourning everything it no longer is. These aren't curiosities. These aren't superstitions. These are sophisticated, deeply human responses to the most universal experience in existence. And when you understand why they do it, you will never look at death, or grief, the same way again. To understand how tribes turn death into celebration, you first need to understand what they believed death actually was. And that belief, more than any ritual, more than any ceremony, is what separates their relationship with death from ours so completely. The modern world operates on a largely linear model of existence. You are born. You live. You die. And death is understood as a termination, the end of a person's presence in the world of the living. The body is removed. The space they occupied is vacated. And the process of grief is, fundamentally, the process of learning to accept an absence. Tribal communities across history rejected this model entirely. Not out of denial. Not out of ignorance. But out of a profoundly different understanding of what a person is, and what death does to them. For the Torajan people of Sulawesi, death is not a moment. It is a process. A long, gradual transition from the world of the living into the world of the ancestors. Until that transition is complete, marked by the proper ceremonies, the proper rituals, the proper communal acknowledgement, the deceased is not considered fully dead. They are considered sick. Resting. Temporarily absent from the conversation but still fundamentally present. This is why a Torajan family will keep their loved one's body in the home for weeks, months, or in some documented cases, years. They speak to them. They bring them food and cigarettes. They update them on family news. They include them in decisions. Because to the Torajan worldview, removing the body before the ceremony is complete would be the equivalent of abandoning someone who is critically ill. The Western observer calls this unusual. The Torajan elder would call abandoning your dying relative to strangers in a sterile building unusual. And here is where the anthropological record becomes genuinely fascinating. Cultures that maintained extended, communal death rituals consistently showed lower rates of what modern psychology now calls complicated grief, the kind of unresolved, isolating mourning that can persist for years and quietly destroy a person's relationship with life itself. The ritual wasn't superstition. It was medicine. The ceremony wasn't performance. It was processing. And what they understood, without a single psychology textbook, was that grief shared across an entire community heals in ways that grief carried alone never can. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody in the modern grief industry wants to examine too closely. Because what happens when you remove the ritual? Not gradually. Not gently. But systematically, replacing centuries of communal death practice with a standardized, time-limited, commercially managed process that sends the grieving back to work within a week and measures recovery in billable therapy sessions. The data is not comfortable. Rates of prolonged grief disorder, a condition where mourning becomes so entrenched it begins to functionally destroy a person's ability to live, have risen consistently across industrialized societies over the past 50 years. Loneliness in grief has reached what researchers now describe as epidemic levels. And the phenomenon of disenfranchised grief, grief that society doesn't formally recognize or support, is now understood to affect millions of people who have never been given the communal space to process loss at all. The tribes didn't have a word for disenfranchised grief, because they never created the conditions that produce it. Consider the Ramba Solo ceremony of the Torajan people, one of the most elaborate death rituals documented anywhere on Earth. A single funeral can last days. It requires the sacrifice of water buffalo, sometimes dozens, as vehicles to carry the deceased into the afterlife with the resources they'll need. It demands the presence of every family member, near and distant. It involves the construction of temporary villages to house the arriving guests. And it costs, in many cases, the equivalent of a family's entire savings. To the Western economist, this looks like financial irrationality. To the Torajan community, spending everything on a proper farewell is the only rational response to losing someone irreplaceable. And then there is the Mourning ritual, the part that stops every Western documentary crew cold. Every few years, Torajan families return to the burial site, retrieve the preserved remains of their ancestors, clean and redress the bodies, and walk them through the village. Not carried. Walked, guided upright through the streets, retracing the paths they walked in life, returning briefly to the world they once occupied. Psychologists studying this practice have noted something extraordinary. The families who participate in Mourning consistently report lower levels of unresolved grief than comparable groups who do not maintain physical connection rituals with their deceased. The act of continuing the relationship, even symbolically, even with remains, appears to satisfy something fundamental in human psychological architecture that simple burial and closure does not. The conflict isn't between primitive and sophisticated. The conflict is between a system built around forgetting and one built around remembering. But the Torajan people are not alone in this. And the deeper you go into the anthropological record, the more a single, uncomfortable truth begins to surface. Every major ancient culture, on every continent, across every era, developed elaborate, communal, extended death rituals. Not one or two. All of them. And the sophistication of those rituals, the psychological intelligence embedded within them, suggests that these communities understood something about human grief that modern clinical psychology is only now beginning to formally document. Take the jazz funeral tradition, rooted directly in West African death ceremonies brought through the brutal displacement of the transatlantic slave trade. Communities stripped of nearly everything, land, language, family, freedom, held on to one thing with extraordinary tenacity, the belief that death deserved to be met with the full force of communal expression. The structure of a traditional jazz funeral is not accidental. It is engineered for grief processing. The procession to the burial site is slow, mournful, the band playing in a minor key, giving the community space to acknowledge the weight of the loss. Then, after burial, the entire emotional architecture shifts. The band breaks into a major key. The second line begins. The mourners become celebrants. The streets fill with dancing. This isn't denial of grief. This is the completion of it. Psychologists studying emotional processing now describe something called affect labeling, the practice of fully naming and experiencing a negative emotion before transitioning through it. The jazz funeral structure does this with breathtaking precision. It names the grief first. Then it moves through it. The community doesn't skip the pain, they walk directly into it, together, and then they walk out the other side, also together. No therapist invented this. A displaced community under unimaginable pressure discovered it, because their survival depended on it. Then there are the death practices of the Himba people of Namibia, one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. When a member of the community dies, the entire village enters a period called Okaruwo, a sacred communal pause. Work stops. Disputes cease. Every member of the community, regardless of their relationship to the deceased, participates in the mourning process. Because in Himba understanding, a death does not belong to a family. A death belongs to everyone. And perhaps most strikingly, the Nyakyusa people of Tanzania held vigils where the entire community would gather through the night, not in silence, but in conversation. Telling stories about the deceased. Laughing at memories. Arguing about their qualities. Keeping the person present through collective narrative for as long as the community needed. Modern psychology now calls this continuing bonds theory, the understanding that maintaining a symbolic relationship with the deceased, rather than achieving detachment and closure, produces healthier long-term grief outcomes. The Nyakyusa community called it Tuesday night. They didn't need a theory. They had a practice. And the practice worked, passed down through generations, refined through centuries of accumulated human wisdom about what loss does to a person and what a person needs to survive it. The pattern is undeniable. Across cultures, across continents, across millennia, the communities that grieve together, loudly, physically, and without a predetermined endpoint produced people who carried loss without being destroyed by it. And the communities that learn to grieve alone, quickly, quietly, and on schedule. The data speaks for itself. Here is the twist. And it arrives not with a shock, but with a quiet, devastating clarity. We didn't evolve away from these rituals because we discovered something better. We abandoned them because they were inconvenient. The industrialization of the 19th and 20th centuries didn't just change how people worked and where they lived. It fundamentally restructured humanity's relationship with death. Bodies moved from homes to hospitals. Funerals moved from community events to commercial services. Grief moved from the village square to the private interior of a person who was expected, within days, to return to productivity. The ritual wasn't replaced with something more effective. It was replaced with something more efficient. And efficiency, it turns out, is a catastrophically inadequate response to loss. Here is what the anthropological and psychological record now confirms, across decades of cross-cultural research. Communities that maintained physical, communal, and extended death rituals showed measurably stronger social cohesion, lower rates of depression following bereavement, faster return to functional daily life, and a fundamentally healthier relationship with their own mortality. They weren't afraid of death the way we are, because they had never been taught to look away from it. The Torajan child who grows up watching Mourning, who helps dress an ancestor's remains, who dances at funerals before they can fully walk, does not grow into an adult paralyzed by the concept of their own mortality. Death is not an abstract horror lurking at the edge of consciousness. It is a known thing. A familiar thing. A thing that has been touched and fed and spoken to and danced with. And that familiarity does not breed morbidity. It breeds freedom. There is a West African proverb that has survived centuries of displacement and transformation: when the music changes, so does the dance. The tribes understood that death is not the end of the music. It is a change in the key. And the only appropriate response, the only human response, is to learn the new steps, gather your community around you, and keep moving. Modern grief told us to sit down, be quiet, and wait for it to pass. Ancient wisdom said, stand up, make noise, and carry your dead with you. The research says the ancient wisdom was right. So here is the question this entire journey leaves you with, and it is not a comfortable one. What have we lost by learning to grieve alone? What does it cost a person across a lifetime to never have their grief witnessed by a community? To never have their dead honored with the full, loud, inconvenient, expensive, time-consuming ceremony that the loss actually deserves? And what would it look like, in your own life, in your own family, to bring even a fraction of that ancient intelligence back? Not to copy a ritual. Not to perform someone else's tradition. But to understand the principle behind it, that grief is not a private malfunction to be managed. It is a communal experience to be shared. That the dead do not need to disappear for the living to survive. And that celebration and mourning are not opposites. They are, at their deepest level, exactly the same thing. If this changed the way you think about death, about grief, about the wisdom locked inside cultures the modern world too quickly dismissed, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us, how does your family honor the dead? And if you want to keep questioning everything you thought you knew about the ancient world, subscribe. Because we're just getting started.